So this is our ongoing discussion of Simondon's individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're going to be reading the last subsection of part 2 of the book on vital individuation today. So that's subsection 5, Topology and Autogenesis. So last week we saw, I think the key idea was this presentation of the notion of information, the two different notions of information. So on the one hand, there's the transmission notion of information. So it's information insofar as it can be transmitted. And this is the concept of information as it's presented in information theory or communication theory. In this notion of information, the quantity of information in a message is inversely proportional to its predictability. So the less predictable the message is, the more information it carries. And then a message that was entirely predictable would carry no information. Then on the other hand, there's the second notion of information, which is related to signification for Simondon. So it's this, we could call it, I guess, the content notion of information as opposed to the signal notion of information. This notion of information is one in which predictability is positively correlated with not quite the quantity of information, because this is not a purely quantitative notion of information, but in another text, Simondon calls this the tension of information. So there's, for example, a shape, a regular shape, like a square or a rectangle or something, is a very simple figure, as opposed to something like a picture of a beach where each grain of sand is in a particular location. And so the simple picture is much more predictable, whereas the picture of the beach is very unpredictable because each grain of sand has to be captured individually. And so in this notion of information, there's a higher degree of information in some sort of vague sense, insofar as the content of a message is more predictable. So it's in a certain respect, it's the opposite of the previous notion of information. And this notion has to do with signification, because it has to do with the receptibility of the message. So it's not just the receiving a signal. So you can have any sort of signal that's received through a communication channel, and that's something that is accounted for in the first notion of information. But then what does the message received actually do on the other end, at the receiver end, or how is it incorporated into the functioning of the receiver, is a question that's not addressed by the quantitative theory of information. And so this second notion of information has to do with that question, or that problem of how the message is incorporated into the functioning of the receiver. So this notion of information, the second notion, has sort of built into it, or part of what underlies it is this notion of disparation that we've seen throughout this part of the book. And so the basic example that Simondon is always working from is that of binocular vision. And in binocular vision, you have slightly different images presented to each eye. Through binocular vision, we somehow combine those two images, or produce this dimension of depth, or we invent or discover a dimension of depth that combines the two images, but without losing anything. So it's not just that we abstract from the two images and get what's common to them. We keep what's different in each image, and it's precisely through that difference that we're able to generate that perception of depth. And Simondon takes this to be the sort of model for any situation of reception of information. So there has to be this disparation as a precondition for there to be a reception of information. And then there has to be something like an invention of a new dimension, or a discovery of a new dimension, in order for the information to play a role in the functioning of the receiver. So that's basically what we saw last time. So let's pick up from the beginning of subsection 5. I'll read the first page or so, and then we'll discuss as usual. Subsection 5, Topology and Ontogenesis. To this day, the problem of the rapport between life and inert matter has above all focused on the problem of the fabrication of living matter from inert matter. The properties of life have been situated in the chemical composition of living substances. Many synthetic bodies have been elaborated since the synthesis of urea. Not only can chemical synthesis produce rather small molecular bodies from catabolic transformations, it can also produce bodies that participate directly in anabolic functions. Nevertheless, there is still quite a gap between the production of substances utilized by life and the production of the living being. To say that we are getting closer to life, we would need to produce the topology of the living being, its particular type of space, the relation between a milieu of interiority and a milieu of exteriority. The bodies of organic chemistry do not bring with them a different topology than that of the usual physical and energetic relations. However, perhaps the topological condition is primordial in the living being qua living being. There is no evidence that we can think the living being adequately by way of Euclidean rapports. Perhaps the space of the living being isn't a Euclidean space. The living being can be considered in Euclidean space, where it is then defined as one body among other bodies. The very structure of the living being can be described in Euclidean terms, but nothing proves that this description is adequate. If there were a set of topological configurations necessary for life, and if they were untranslatable into Euclidean terms, then every attempt to make a living being with the matter elaborated by organic chemistry would have to be considered insufficient. Perhaps the essence of the living being is a certain topological arrangement that cannot be known based on the physics and chemistry that typically use Euclidean space. Currently, we can do nothing but remain content with conjectures in this domain. It is nevertheless interesting to observe that the properties of living matter manifest more as the maintaining and self-sustaining of certain topological conditions than as pure energetic or structural conditions. In this sense, one of the properties at the basis of all the functions, be it the conduction of nerve impulses, muscular contraction, or assimilation, is the polarized asymmetrical nature of cellular permeability. The living membrane, which is anatomically differentiated or merely functional, when no particular formation materializes its limit, is characterized as what separates a region of interiority from a region of exteriority. The membrane is polarized and therefore allows the passage of some particular bodies centripetally or centrifugally when blocking the passage of some other particular body. No doubt the mechanism of this permeability can function in a single direction for a definite type of chemical substance. This is how we have explained the activation of the muscles through the intermediary of the neuromuscular junction by an unleashing of acetylcholine, which momentarily breaks down the potential of the polarized membrane. But this just pushes the problem back, since the membrane is living precisely in the sense that it always repolarizes, as if it were, according to Gellhorn's expression, a sodium-potassium pump. It recreates the polarization of the membrane after functioning. An inert membrane would very quickly be reduced to the neutral state in its functioning as a selective membrane. On the contrary, the living membrane conserves this property. It regenerates this characteristic asymmetry of its existence and functioning. It could be said that the living substance within the membrane regenerates the membrane, but that the membrane is what guarantees that the living being is alive each moment, since this membrane is selective. It is what maintains the milieu of interiority as a milieu of interiority relative to the milieu of exteriority. It could be said that the living being lives at the limits of itself, on its limit. In a simple and unicellular organism, there is a direction toward the inside and a direction toward the outside relative to this limit. In a multicellular organism, the existence of the interior milieu complicates topology in the sense that there are several stages of interiority and exteriority. Thus, an endocrine gland empties the products of its activity into the bloodstream or some other organic liquid. The typical organism's interior milieu is in fact a milieu of exteriority relative to this gland. Likewise, the intestinal cavity is an exterior milieu for the assimilating cells that perform selective absorption within the intestinal tract. According to the topology of the living organism, the interior of the intestines is in fact exterior to the organism, though within this space, a certain number of transformations conditioned and controlled by the organic functions are performed. This space is an annexed exteriority. Thus, if the contents of the stomach or the intestines are harmful to the organism, the coordinated movements that aid in expulsion will empty these cavities and evacuate into the completely exterior, independent space the harmful substances that were in the exterior space annexed to the interiority. Similarly, the progression of chyme is regulated by the different successive degrees of the biochemical activities of this chyme, which is controlled by interoceptors that are in fact sense organs, and would more appropriately be called medioceptors, since they apprehend an information relative to the exterior annexed space and not relative to veritable interiority. I'll stop there for now, because this goes on. Yeah, so this first bit is about, he uses this term topology here, which, so the basic meaning of topology is, it has to do with, it's a mathematical discipline that is about relations of neighborhood, of one point being a neighbor of another, or of a region being the neighborhood of a point. What topology, so in relation to, or in contrast to geometry, topology doesn't have, or is not based on a notion of distance. So there's no distance measurement in the same way that you have in geometry, which means that in topology, you're only looking at relationships between points and not like a distance between points. And the relationship that Simondon was talking about here in particular is the interior versus exterior relationship. And so the most basic form of this relationship in living beings is across a membrane. A membrane in a living organism is generally permeable to certain substances and impermeable to others. And also it has a polarity in the sense that it is permeable in one direction but not in another. Something like potassium is held on the inside of a membrane, and then there's a release mechanism that uses that potassium, releases the potassium in some biological process, and then there's a sort of recharging process where the potassium is builds up again on the inside of the membrane. And yeah, so Angus, your question, is it topological because of this relation between exterior and interior? Yes, I think that's right. He contrasts this with a Euclidean geometry. So this is the standard geometry of three-dimensional space with a distance metric on it. The exterior interior contrast is a topological one, and then in Euclidean space you would have something like a distance metric. So you would have not just exterior and interior, but there would be distances between different portions of the organism or the structure, whatever it is. Right. So a living being has a membrane that separates an inside and an outside in terms of what is allowed to pass in which direction across the membrane. And so Simondon contrasts this with a Euclidean geometry because there's no notion of distance in a living organism or in the structure of a living organism in the way that there is this inside versus outside contrast. So then he goes on to, so he talks about some of the properties of living matter versus inert matter. And so he points out that organic chemistry is capable of synthesizing various compounds that exist in living beings. And so the first one was urea, which was sometime in the mid-19th century, I forget exactly when, which was the first organic compound that was synthesized by chemists. But then he points out that organic chemistry has advanced to the point where it's capable of synthesizing not just the products of catabolic reaction, so the products of breaking down some sort of structure inside the organism, but it's also capable of producing the compounds that participate in anabolic processes, so the processes that build up structures. But despite this advance of organic chemistry, he says we're not really any closer to synthesizing a living organism until we have something like this interior versus exterior structure. So we can produce chemicals that occur within living organisms, but we're not really any closer to synthesizing a living organism itself. And then there's this line that Angus has pointed to in the chat, that a living being lives at the limit of itself on its limit. And this is also true of the crystal, as Angus pointed out. So the crystal also individuates at the limit, and this is something Simondon has discussed in the chapter, or in the part on physical individuation. So there's definitely the crystal that crystallizes across the limit, across its surface, is similar to the way that the living being exists around its membrane or across its membrane. But as we'll see later on in this part that we're reading today, the crystal, the interior of the crystal is basically dead. As soon as one layer has crystallized, the interior that layer is then effectively inert for the purpose of crystallization. So you can take a crystal and you can hollow out the interior as long as you leave enough to to keep the structural integrity of the outer shell. You can just hollow out the interior, and the crystal will continue to grow in the same way as it did before. So the interior has no impact on the continuing process of individuation. Whereas in a living being, of course, you can't just hollow out a living being and have it continue to live in the same way as it did before. So there's a relationship between the interior and the exterior in a living being in a way that there isn't in the case of a crystal. But we'll see more on that when we get to that point. And then maybe the last point before we move on, there's also within living organisms there are sort of relative degrees of interiority and exteriority. So there's the completely exterior. There's what's outside the skin of the organism, outside the organism's external boundary. But then inside the organism, there are body cavities that are relatively exterior. So there's the digestive tract, for example, is relatively exterior. It serves as an internal exterior in a way. So there's something exterior to the rest of the body, but it's interior to the boundaries of the body as a whole. In the case of endocrine glands that he points to, the bloodstream serves as an exterior into which the glands release their products. And so there's this sense of relative exteriority. And so you can have multiple levels of one organ or one system serving as the exterior to another one. And you could have as many different levels of interiority and exteriority as you want. And so this is characteristic of multicellular organisms, because there's not just one cell membrane that makes up the structure, but you have an outer skin and then interior exteriorities, if you want to put it that way. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so of this multi-page paragraph. So if someone else wants to pick up from "We therefore find" on page 252.
We therefore find various levels of interiority in an organism. The space of the digestive cavities is a space of exteriority with respect to the blood that floods the intestinal walls, but the blood in turn is a milieu of exteriority with respect to the endocrine glands that empty the products of their activity into the blood. It can therefore be said that the structure of a complex organism is not just integration and differentiation. It is also this establishment of a transductive mediation of interiorities and exteriorities, going from an absolute interiority to an absolute exteriority through different mediators of relative interiority and exteriority. Organisms could be classified according to the number of mediations of interiority and exteriority that they utilize to carry out their functions. The simplest organism, which can be called elementary, is the one that does not possess a immediate interior milieu, but merely an absolute interior and an absolute exterior. For this organism, the characteristic polarity of life is on the level of the membrane. It's here that life essentially exists as an aspect of a dynamic topology that itself maintains the metastability through which it exists. Life is the self-sustaining of a metastability, but this metastability requires a topological condition. Structure and function are linked together, since the deepest and most initial vital structure is topological. The structure of integration and differentiation only appears in complex organisms with the appearance of the nervous system and the distinction between sense organs, effectors, and neural centers. This non-topological structure of integration and differentiation appears as a means of mediation and organization in order to support and extend the first structure, which remains not only subjacent but also fundamental. Thus, we do not grasp the structure of the organism when we start from the organismic unity of the complex ensembles of evolved organisms, since we run the risk of attributing a privilege to the organization of integration and differentiation. We can no longer account for the veritable structure of the living being by considering considering the cells that compose a complex organism according to the atomistic method as architectonic units of this organism. The totalizing vision and the elementary vision are equally inadequate. We have to start with the basic function that depends on the first topological structure of interiority and exteriority. And then we have to see how this function is mediated by a chain of intermediary interiorities and exteriorities. At the two ends of the chain, there is still the absolute interior and the absolute exterior. The functions of integration and differentiation are in the function of metastable asymmetry between absolute interiority and absolute exteriority. This is why living individuation must be thought according to topological schemata. Furthermore, topological structures are those by means of which the evolving organism's spatial problems can be resolved. Thus, the development of the neocortex in superior species essentially occurs through a folding of the cortex. This is a topological solution, not a Euclidean solution. It is then understood why the cortical homunculus is nothing but a very approximate representation of the cortical areas of projection. Projection, in fact, converts a Euclidean space into a topological space, such that the cortex is not adequately represented in a Euclidean fashion. All things considered, we should not speak of projection for the cortex, even though there is, in the geometrical sense of the term, projection for the small regions. Sorry, I lost my spot. We should say a conversion of Euclidean space into topological space. The basic functional structures are topological. The corporeal schema converts these topological structures into Euclidean structures through a mediate system of relations that is the very dimensionality of the corporeal schema.
Again, just continuing this idea about relative degrees of interiority. So you can have an internal body cavity that serves as the exterior for some other organ or some other system within the organism. And he contrasts this interior and exterior structure of the organism with this notion of integration and differentiation that we've seen before in this part of the book. So he says that this integration and differentiation structure is not sufficient to account for the structure of a living being. So we have to hold on to something like the interior versus exterior distinction and the different degrees of interiority and exteriority. We have to hold on to that as well as the notion of integration and differentiation at the same time. There are sort of two opposite errors or two opposite insufficient accounts for the living being that he here calls the atomistic and the totalizing, he says the totalizing vision and the elementary vision. So these are two different errors you can make in trying to account for the living organism. So on the one hand, the elementary or the atomistic vision would be one that takes the cell to be the basic elements of a living being, and the living being is basically just a composite of a bunch of different cells. And then the other one is one that takes the whole organism as a whole, and only looks at that organism insofar as it is a whole, and treats it as one entity. So that it sort of overemphasizes the exterior boundary, the boundary between the absolute exterior and the rest of the organism. What we have to do instead is hold on to something like the middle ground between these two extremes, or these two incorrect ways of analyzing the living being. And so we have to have the two ends of the chain. So we have the absolute exterior and the absolute interior, but then you also have in the middle ground, in between the two, you have the other links of the chain, the relative interior and exterior portions or systems within the organism. And then he points to certain structures that have this topological nature, so that they represent. So maybe the example is the easiest way to explain this. So he points to the cortical homunculus, for example, which I posted the image in the chat here. But there are certain areas within the human brain that map onto different parts of the body, both in the sensory portions of the cortex and in the motor areas of the cortex. But the mapping is not like a sort of to scale mapping. So certain regions of the body have much more dense representation in the homuncular the cortical homunculus. So, for example, the hands are represented in a much bigger region of the cortex than the proportion of a human body that a hand makes up, and the face as well is a big portion of the cortex. But you have these representations of different regions of the body, but it's not. It doesn't preserve distances. It doesn't preserve the scale of the different parts of the body. Different regions are represented in different proportions. So you can see on the little diagram that the face and the hands take up more than like the whole rest of the body in terms of how much of the cortex is represented. And so this is an example for Simondon of a topological solution to a problem of space. So how do you how the problem being how to create a mapping of the body onto the cortex, and here it's a topological mapping rather than a geometrical one. So we can go on to the next bit. If someone wants to read from If Living Individuation.
If living individuation is a process that essentially unfolds according to topological structurations, then it is understood why the borderline cases between inert matter and the living being are precisely cases of processes that unfold according to the dimensions of exteriority and interiority. These cases include the individuation of crystals. The difference between the living being and the inert crystal consists in the fact that the interior space of the inert crystal does not serve to keep extending the individuation carried out at the limits of the crystal undergoing growth. There is only interiority and exteriority from the one molecular layer to another, from an already deposited molecular layer to a layer about to be deposited. A crystal could be deprived of an important part of its substance without stopping its growth. The interior is not homostatic and in its entirety relative to the exterior, or more exactly, relative to the limit of polarity. In order for the crystal to individuate, it must continue to grow. This individuation is superficial. The past doesn't serve a purpose in the crystal's mass. It merely plays a role of bare support and does not provide the availability of an information signal. The succession of time is not condensed. Conversely, in the living being, the space of interiority with its content plays a role for the perpetuation of individuation throughout the whole being. There is and can be resonance because what has been produced by individuation in the past belongs to the content of the interior space. The whole content of the interior space is topologically in contact with the content of the exterior space at the limits of the living being. Indeed, there is no distance in topology. The whole mass of living matter in the interior space is actively present to the exterior world at the limit of the living being. All the products of the past individuation are present immediately and without distance. The fact of belonging to the milieu of interiority does not merely signify being inside, in the Euclidean sense, but being on the interior side of the limit without a delay in functional efficacy, without isolation, without inertia. The living being doesn't just interiorize by assimilating. It condenses and presents everything that has been elaborated in the successive. This function of individuation is spatio-temporal. In addition to a topology of the living being, it would be necessary to define a chronology of the living being associated with its topology. which would be as elementary as it, and different from the physical form of time, as topology is different from the structure of Euclidean space. In the same way that there are no distances in topology, in chronology, there is no quantity of time. This in no way means that the time of vital individuation is continuous, as Bergson claims. Continuity is one of the possible chronological schemata, but it is not the only one. Schemata of discontinuity, contiguity, and envelopment can be defined in chronology as well as in topology. Whereas Euclidean space and physical time cannot coincide, the schemata of chronology and topology are applicable to one another. They are not distinct, and they form the first dimensionality of the living being. Every topological characteristic has a chronological correlate, and vice versa. Thus, for living substance, the fact of being within the interior of the selective polarized membrane means that this substance has been held in the condensed past. The fact that substance is in the milieu of exteriority means that this substance can come forth, put itself forward for assimilation, and possibly breach or harm the living individual. The substance is to come, à venir. The interior past and the exterior future confront each other at the level of the polarized milieu. This confrontation in the operation of selective assimilation is in the present of the living being, which is formed by this polarity of passage of obstruction between past substances and substances to come that are present to one another via the operation of individuation. The present is this metastability of rapport between interior and exterior, past and future. The exterior is exterior and the interior is interior relative to this mutual allegmatic activity of presence. Topology and chronology coincide in the individuation of the living being. It is only later on, and according to the physical and collective individuations, that the coincidence can be broken. Topology and chronology are not a priori forms of sensibility, but the very dimensionality of the living being undergoing individuation.
Right. So the question now is the difference between the case of physical individuation, the case of the crystal that we saw in the part on physical individuation, and the case of the living being. So as we discussed, the living being lives across its membrane, across its boundary, and this is similar to the way that the crystal individuates across its limit. But the difference here is that in the case of the crystal, in a previous passage about this notion, Simondon said that the interior in the crystal is anterior, is past in this sort of radical sense, in that so the crystal individuates at that limit that separates it from its surrounding medium, and then what has already crystallized, what's on the interior of the crystal, is just inert. It has no effect on the ongoing process of individuation. Whereas in the case of the living organism, the interior is simultaneous with the limit of the organism. So it's not sort of stuck in the past in the way that it is in the case of the crystal. It's instead we have a sort of simultaneity of the interior and the limit of the organism. Right. So because of this, it means that the whole interior of the living organism is simultaneous to itself. It's simultaneous to the boundary and to itself in a way that the crystal is not. So the crystal has this sort of temporal structure that stretches out through time in a way that the living organism instead has a sort of simultaneous temporal structure. And Simondon suggests that we should have something analogous to topology for time, in the same way that topology has to do with space and gives this notion of relationships in space without distance metrics. Likewise, we would have a notion of relationships in time or of temporal structure that would not have some sort of measurement of lengths of time. And so he calls this chronology, which I think he doesn't use this term throughout the rest of the book. I think it's just this passage. But so we can think chronology is to time as topology is to space, effectively, is the analogy that he's using here. And so he suggests, against Bergson, he suggests that this doesn't mean that chronology or the chronological form of individuation is necessarily continuous. So there can be multiple different structures of chronology. So you have continuous ones, but also discontinuous ones, and various different relations between different portions of time in a living organism. Yeah, the bit on chronology is a little bit abstract in comparison to the topology stuff. But I think we can think of this. I had mentioned earlier the way that the living organism is simultaneous with itself, but there's another respect in which the living organism also has a temporal structure, in the sense that what is interior is something that is already created, and then the boundary at which the organism grows is a boundary between past and future. So if we think of something like our sponges or corals and so on that we looked at in earlier parts of this part on vital individuation, they can regenerate. If a portion is mutilated, they can regenerate, and so that boundary is a boundary not just between exterior and interior, but also between past and future, in the sense that what is inside the boundary has already been elaborated and developed, and then what is outside the boundary will in the future be elaborated and developed. So that's sort of the idea of the interior of the relationship between the chronology and topology, is that you have this temporal structure across the boundary between past and future, in the same way that you have the topological structure across the boundary between interior and exterior. And then there's this little bit here, is a sort of play on words, I guess, which I think is what footnote 66, I think, is explaining that probably, where, so in French, the word for future is avenir, which like you can break down into to arrive or to come. So here he uses and then he also uses the word advenir, which means, well, here it's translated as come forth, but I think you could also translate it as to happen. And so there's a sort of play on words where he says that something exterior arrives or comes forth or happens. It has this nature of being to come or being future, and so there's a sort of play on words which doesn't really translate that well, but there's this notion of the exterior as something that can arrive or that can happen, and the futureness is the results or is a consequence of that characteristic. And then the last bit here is where he says that topology and chronology are not a priori forms of sensibility. And so here, again, this is a criticism or a demarcation from Kant, and he's done this a couple times throughout the book so far, where he's sort of set out the difference between his conception and Kant's conception. And so, of course, for Kant, space and time are the two forms of sensibility. So, and then the matter is the sense impressions or the effect on us of what is outside of us in some mysterious way. and the forms of sensibility are imposed on the matter that arrives from without. Simondon argues, or the way he presents it here, he suggests that topology and chronology, so space and time, are not a priori forms of sensibility. So they're not imposed on some sort of matter that comes from outside. Rather, a living being undergoing individuation generates something like a topology and a chronology. That's part of what it is for a living being to individuate, is to have an interior and an exterior, and the corresponding notions with respect to chronology.
This point that he makes here about the present being the sort of moment of selective assimilation at the surface, I guess. I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, but we were talking about the way that he was talking about the present in relation to the collective. And Nan, I think you suggested that is a limited kind of present that doesn't always occur, and there might be another kind of present in vital individuation that doesn't necessarily involve, being part of the collective. I wonder if this is the present that like all vital individuation experiences, which is distinct from like the present of the collective.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good suggestion. I think that makes sense. So yeah, this notion of a present as the selection of something that can pass from the outside to the inside, or that passes from the future to the past. I think for Simondon, this is a notion that is universal for all vital individuation. So anything that is undergoing vital individuation will have this kind of presence. Whereas the notion of the present that we saw last time with the in relation to the collective, I think I think we have to understand that as a notion of the present that is rare. Like whenever he talks about collective individuation, it doesn't just mean a group of individuals or a group of people that sort of gather together. The actual process of collective individuation is something that only occurs rarely, or from time to time. It's not a sort of everyday occurrence, and so that present can't be the same as this present. So yeah, I think this present might be the one that we were sort of looking for last time, the one that all organisms, as insofar as they are undergoing vital individuation, would share. Okay, so we're almost done this section, so I think I'll read the next bit up to the end of the subsection here. We would therefore need a word to designate this initially singular dimensionality that later splits into a separate temporal dimensionality and a separate spatial dimensionality. It is not only this word, but also the set of unified representations allowing for it to have a precise meaning existed, it would perhaps be possible to think morphogenesis, to interpret the signification of forms, and to understand this first relation of the living being to the universe and to other living beings that can be understood neither according to the laws of the physical world, nor according to the structures of the complicated psyche. Even before sensory motor structures, there must be chronological and topological structures, namely the universe of tropisms, tendencies, and drives. The psychology of expression, which is still too detached and arbitrary, albeit grounded in its research, would perhaps find a path for axiomatization in a similar topological and chronological research. Furthermore, this type of research could perhaps allow us to understand why there are intermediary processes between those of the inert world and those of the animate world, like the formation of crystallizable viruses, such as, for example, the Mosaic virus of tobacco. This virus develops like a living being within the sap of the plant. It assimilates because if the tobacco plant is inoculated with a certain quantity of this virus, the quantity of virus increases. After extracting sap from the plant and then crystallizing the virus, we obtain a greater quantity of crystallizable virus. In contrast, when this virus is crystallized, nothing allows us to say that it is alive. It is no more alive than hemoglobin or chlorophyll. If chemical bodies are found that are capable of assimilating into the state of the solution without requiring a crystallizable germ, a crystalline germ in a supersaturated or supercooled solution. A part of the gap that separates living processes from physical-chemical processes would be bridged. The case of viruses indeed seems to be intermediary between the two orders of processes. However, it should be noted that the Mosaic virus of tobacco only assimilates into a living milieu. I think that should be in a living milieu. The potentials of the living plant can therefore be utilized by the virus, a virus which in this sense would not be veritably alive if its activity of assimilation is in reality a borrowed activity, sustained and nourished by the plant's activity. The problem has not been resolved to this day. It can just be said that it would certainly be necessary to consider this problem as implying a formation of an axiomatic according to chronology and topology, and not merely according to physical-chemical knowledge. The study of elementary operations does not imply an atomism. It is regrettable that the holistic systematics of biologism, such as it is presented by Goldstein, is conceived necessarily as macrophysical and is fixated on the totality of a complex organism. Goldstein's Parmenidean ontology prevents any relation between the study of the living being and the study of inert beings, whose processes are microphysical. There can be an intermediary order of phenomena between fragmentary microphysics and the macrophysical organismic unit. This order would be that of genetic, chronological, and topological processes, i.e. processes of individuation belonging to all the orders of reality in which ontogenesis takes place. An axiomatic of ontogenesis remains to be discovered, at least if this axiomatic is definable. It could be that ontogenesis is not able to be axiomatized, which would explain the existence of philosophical thought as perpetually marginal with respect to all other studies, since philosophical thought is what is driven by the implicit or explicit research of ontogenesis in all orders of reality. So he talks here about these viruses, these crystallizable viruses, and viruses have this strange status of sort of being intermediate between living beings and inert matter, because so as Simondon explains here, if you take a virus outside of an organism, it's just a piece of protein basically that has this RNA strand inside it, and it doesn't really do anything on its own. It doesn't. It unlike a living being in the proper sense, it doesn't assimilate nutrition. It doesn't take in material from its environment or energy from its environment and metabolize and do things with it. It's inert as long as it's outside of its host organism. But then when you introduce it into its host organism, then it does reproduce, and then so it has this property that we associate with living beings. So it reproduces itself, and it can increase in numbers inside the living organism. And so I think at the time Simondon was writing, I don't think the mechanism of viral reproduction had been established yet, but we now know that viruses reproduce basically by hijacking the cells of the host organism. So if it's like a tobacco plant, for example, the virus inserts its own RNA into the cells of the tobacco plant, and basically makes the tobacco plant cells produce more viruses instead of doing what they normally do, and which is why viral infection is a kind of disease, because it interferes with the normal functioning of the organism. Yeah, so Simondon sort of raises this possibility. He says, like, I forget exactly where he says that, but he says the potentials of the living plant can therefore be utilized by the virus, a virus which in this sense would not be veritably alive if its activity of assimilation is in reality a borrowed activity sustained and nourished by the plant's activity. And so this possibility is in fact the one that we know now is the case. So the virus only reproduces by making the plant or the host organism reproduce itself, to reproduce the virus, that is. So in that sense, we would probably not want to say that a virus is alive. It sort of has the property of being reproducible and of spreading throughout living organisms, but we might not want to describe it as alive itself. So it has a sort of borrowed life. It only lives through other living beings. And then Simondon suggests that we would need to have some sort of general term that would cover both topology and chronology. And later on he uses genetic as the term that covers both of these domains. So the genetic or morphogenesis or individuation would be the term for what exists prior to the separation between chronology and topology. So it's a sort of a notion of relations of ordering and independent of whether those are spatial or temporal orderings. And so then he suggests that this notion of a genetic ordering would serve to sort of systematize certain parts of psychology. And he refers here to the psychology of expression, but I'm not sure exactly what that is meant to. Where is that? Yeah, the psychology of expression. I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind when he talks about that psychology of expression, but he suggests that it would benefit from this notion of genetic or morphogenetic ordering relationship. And then he just sort of in passing right at the end of the subsection, he suggests that ontogenesis might be something that is not axiomatizable, so it's not reducible to some sort of systematized theory. It's something that can only be which has this sort of marginal existence. So if philosophical thought is a research into ontogenesis, then this would be why philosophy always has this sort of marginal role. It is never on the secure path of a science, as Kant puts it. It is never something that just develops and progresses in a uniform manner. It's always sort of restarting and reformulating itself. And so here we can take this as a sort of meta-philosophical statement. So this is Simondon telling us a little bit about how he understands what philosophy is doing. And so it's philosophy is always about ontogenesis, a research into ontogenesis in all orders of reality. And we could, I think, take the converse proposition that research into ontogenesis is philosophical. So insofar as a particular domain of research becomes research into ontogenesis, then it's also philosophical to that extent. And so that sort of explains why Simondon is sort of drawing on all these different scientific disciplines, because he's taking like the little bits where they start approaching this notion of ontogenesis. He's taking the ontogenetic bits of different sciences and assembling them into this philosophical enterprise. So I suggested at the outset today that we could have a shorter session because we're just at the end of this part of the book, and so I thought it would be better to finish the one part today and then start on psychic individuation next time. If anyone has any questions or comments or anything about this whole part of the book, we could go over that before we end today. So anything on vital individuation and how it sort of fits together. If you have any questions or comments, now's the time.
Yeah, we've been reading the same chapter for many months, right?
Yes, it's been probably 2 or 3 months now that we've been on vital individuation. So we did psychic individuation, which was longer. We did physical individuation, which was longer, and then we did vital individuation, which was a little bit shorter. But we're more than halfway through the book now. The two parts on psychic individuation and collective individuation are considerably shorter. So let's see. And I have the French one here. I don't have the English, but yeah, it's about 100 pages left in the French from where we are. So I don't know exactly how much in the English translation, but we're more than halfway, probably closer to 2/3 of the way through the book.
One thing that I was going to ask about was collective individuation. Is that coming up, or have y'all already done that?
No, so we have psychic individuation is the next chapter, and then collective individuation after that.
Okay.
But he has done some sort of previews of collective individuation. There was one that we saw last week or the week before, I think 2 weeks ago, on the relationship between collective individuation and death, the way that the individual entity or the individual living organism dies and sort of lives on in the collective or passes on its individuation into the collective. Right. Yeah. So Angus has posted the reference to that one. Thanks. Yeah. So he's sort of interspersed a couple of different previews of collective individuation throughout this part of the book as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that helps a lot. I'm just trying to get back in the rhythm of things, and the psychic and collective individuation was more what I was kind of intrigued by. So I'm glad that I'm coming back right at the right spot, apparently.
Yeah, and we're glad to have you back. But yeah, anytime that you're available and we have the material that you're interested in, then yeah, feel free to join.
Yeah, hopefully I'll have more time for you now to converse on Sundays. So it looks good. I'm optimistic.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. I hope we get some Hegelian comments as well, because there's been a few instances where he brings up dialectics and why his approach to individuation and autogenesis is not dialectical, and his sort of criticism of dialectics. So I'd be interested to hear your take on some of those bits.
I bet he thinks it's like too chronological.
Yeah, he thinks that so one bit is the linearity that he ascribes to dialectics. So yeah, this notion that there's like a set sequence of stages that it has to pass through,
right?
Which I don't think is a very good understanding of dialectics. And then another criticism that he makes, or another distinction that he makes between his own approach and dialectics, is that he doesn't think there's a moment of negation, or like a negative and then negation of the negation. He thinks that we have this disparation sort of plays the role of that negative moment, but it doesn't disappear. It's not itself negated later on. So he thinks there's a sort of preservation of that disparation rather than a negation of the negation.
That sounds like close to classical dialectics as opposed to Hegelian.
Yeah, I think he would see his own approach as closer to Platonic dialectics rather than Hegelian.
Yeah, I just kind of recently kind of stumbled into the maze of the evolution of what dialectics means throughout, from early to late Plato and all that. So it's interesting to see that I like to kind of recapture the the broader historical use of the term dialectic and bring it back to what I think is its proper context even for understanding Hegel, to be quite honest.
Oh, that's amazing. Do you have any recommendation book about dialectics? Because I'm very interested in that topic too.
Yeah, actually, I think I just downloaded some recent. I'm organizing my downloaded books right now, but I'm here. Let me go and look and see if I can dip and find. One second.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Yeah, the whole notion of dialectics, of course, has like a really complicated history because it changes meaning so much over the course of time, and different authors use it in different ways. Oh yeah, so there it is in the chat. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm getting better at having like books accessible really quickly, like organizing, getting everything tied up. And yeah, hopefully I can do a lot more of that.
That sounds like a good plan, because my downloads folder is just full of like hundreds of PDFs that I haven't gotten to yet. So
yeah,
it's like sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I was just saying yes.
The title is development from Plato to Aristotle. Like, is it gonna stay with the Greeks, or is it gonna be also like, are we gonna have in that book the modern definitions too?
Oh no! This is strictly kind of recapturing that kind of classic conception of the dialect and getting to that, because that's like.
Because I'm looking for a general book, more general, that has like until nowadays, modern days. Like, it's like we were taking this exact class, and they were saying very cool comparisons between Zizek's dialectics and Badiou's dialectics. So I'm also interested in the modern ones too.
Sure. I mean, I implicitly now always think of it as building upon the classic project because of the kind of, well, I don't know. It seems to be a method, at least, that eliminates confusion by rooting it in kind of a feeling of historical necessity, if nothing else. So, I mean, I think that this is, I mean, there probably is an awesome book out there that's like the entire history of the dialectic and like from every philosopher and what they've done with the dialectic. But I think that this is probably the best diving board, at least. I think that in the kind of contemporary association is almost exclusively like Hegelian because of just kind of happenstance, I think. So it's nice to get a little broader perspective than just the only Hegel dialectic definition.
Yeah, I think if you want to have something like on everyone's contemporary use of dialectics, you might have to write that book yourself, because I don't know if anyone has done. Actually, something comes to mind. I'll see if I can find it right away. But yeah, I don't know if anyone's done like sort of like a general account of dialectics as it's used in different contemporary philosophies.
It would probably there would have to be like maybe like say like 7 or 8 volume series of like dialectic, because it's so consequential in so many different epochs of historical progress or philosophical history, one of the two.
So Angus has a question in the chat here about internal resonance. So is internal resonance the same as the transductive mediation between different levels of interiority and exteriority on page 252? It's a good question. I'm not sure. Let me go back to 252 here. I'm trying to find that bit. So the transductive mediation between different levels of interiority and exteriority. Oh yeah, here it is. I think that's right. I think I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, I think that in the case of vital individuation, internal resonance is the same as this transductive mediation between interiorities and exteriorities, so it's related to analogical functions. So yeah, transduction is always connected to analogy for Simondon, or those two terms are sort of linked to each other. Yeah, there's an analogical nature of internal resonance or something like that. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up? Okay, so yeah, let's end here for today. We'll pick up from the beginning of psychic individuation next time. So thank you everyone for joining in and for your contributions, and see you next week.